So I would like to now introduce Luka Skansi, who's an architecture historian, associate professor at Politecnico di Milano, and his research ranges across different geographical and historical contexts of the 20th century, focusing on the themes of spatializing architecture, geopolitics, and its relationship to politics. And we actually invited Luka. I think you mentioned it, that you're just published, or you worked on a collection of younger Tafuri's texts. So maybe you can just say a few words about your Italian book that you just worked on. And we're happy to have you. So you can feel free to start.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I am not with you in Prague. I would really like to have this opportunity to meet you all and talk to all of you. My book is actually, yes, it was published by Quadlibet in 2022. And for the first time, let's say, collects and puts into a kind of general context the theoretical work of the first Manfredo Tafuri, on topics that I will also talk about now. Can I start my paper? Probably yes.
Yes.
And I hope that you hear me well. So it is universally recognized that Manfredo Tafuri's reading of the reality of the city on architecture belongs to the broad tradition of Marxist criticism and society. However, I believe that simply stating and knowing this does little to help us to grasp the complexity of Tafuri's thought. The reason is quite straightforward. There is as many shades of Marxist thought as there have been figures who have taken it up. And in the Italian political and intellectual context of the post-war period is a kind of, I would say, kaleidoscope of positions, more or less aligned, more or less in constant conflict with one another, but also very transformist over time. So placing Tafuri within post-war Italy is not only necessary, but also, I would say, very complex, because the more one digs, the more one realizes that his brain cannot be described through simple and fixed formulas or schematic interpretations. His thought cannot be explained simply through the lens of a specific ideology, a particular intellectual connection, or maybe a political party. Once we note Tafuri's interest toward Sartre, Argan, Adorno, Gramsci, Enzo Paci, etc., we are merely observing a generational interest shared by many of the colleagues of his generations. And this tells us little about the reasons for Tafuri's engagement with these authors, or more precisely, tell us less about how he uses them and to what end. What can be done, and what I personally consider useful, is rather to pursue two things. One hand, to explain how and why Tafuri formed his political ideas and his way of being Marxist. And here it will be very important, if not fundamental, really to contextualize this Marxism of Tafuri within the Italian culture of the 1960s. On the other side, to understand who really were his companions during this specific historical moment. So which intellectuals, and especially in which stages of his career, that his career changes, I would say, year after year, if not. In short, to reconstruct these fragments of that kaleidoscope that I talked about, these fragments may help us to bring into focus an image that would otherwise be quite blurred. My intentions here is to focus on a very, very young Tafuri, just graduated and about to embark on a career, in his career to become an architect, an urban planner, a critic, activist, and also, only partially, a historian. I would like to begin with 1964, which is, as I see it, the year in which it becomes clear that history will become his primary field of action. And believe me, nothing in his educational trajectory makes evident that history would be the exclusive domain of his intellectual commitment. 1964 is the year to which two monographs were published, the first on one of his mentors, Ludovico Quaroni, and the other on the architecture of Japan. So 1964 is also the year in which he begins to write his first internationally significant book that will be published in 1968. This is Theory and History of Architecture. But we don't know exactly at what stage in the writing on his book on Japanese architecture Tafuri encounters Jean-Paul Sartre. In this text, The Cold War and Unity of Culture, published in Rinascita in 1962, the French philosopher identified a pressing question that weighed upon intellectuals of that time: the role that they were to assume in the face of the geopolitical changes of the post-war period, an issue that is today strikingly relevant. With the radical polarization of the world, following of course the outbreak of the Cold War, Sartre argued that cultural production, whether more or less, let's say, serving the respective institutional system, found itself isolated, barricaded in its own trenches, that built by itself in opposition to the cultural production of the antagonistic bloc. This opposition manifested itself in many different forms and in modes which this culture was disseminated, in the aggression with which each side speculated about the other, and in the misunderstandings that Sartre said that are mainly Western ones, but also in their very intimate analytical methodologies. On both sides, despite attempts to assert their autonomy, culture found itself captive by the Cold War. For Sartre, the task, and this will be important, the task of Marxist criticism was to re-establish the lost unitarian space of the dialogue, astonishingly, I would say, contemporary. By embracing the entire field of the analysis of that time. That means from history of literature, history, psychology, architecture, art, and so on. But this was not to be achieved through artificial bridges, simple cultural relationship, but through a serious, Sartre says, relentless analysis, through the historization of contemporary phenomena, through recovering life, I'm quoting, by rediscovering contradictions. Sartre ultimately asked, without the unity of culture, East and West, etc., how can we conceive a real opposition? In other words, if the common ground is geopolitical confrontation rather than the critical analysis of cultural and political systems, if the common ground is hostility in the present rather than a shared historical space to be investigated, if the common ground is the mythologization of one's own models rather than unmasking, then cultures reveal themselves to be inert, inconsistent, and as I said before, entrenched in the prejudices dictated by their political sphere of belonging. From Andrew Leach's pioneering studies onward, Sartre's influence on the young Tafuri has been very well documented. Moreover, it was repeatedly confirmed by the Roman historian himself in several interviews. And I am evoking Sartre here not to reconstruct only a biography, but especially because Sartre represents methodological critical incipit to Tafuri reflection on this young formative period. To be a historian, to be an intellectual, and to be, I would say, in the world, meant for Tafuri, I believe, two things. On one hand, coming to terms with one's responsibility towards society, and on the other, responsibility toward history. We will see what that does mean. And how is this done? By analytically criticizing dominant ideologies, with the aim of unmasking them. While unmasking politics may be easy, the challenge lies in dissecting the role of architecture and especially of architects. Architecture as part of the processes of transformation, of city, of reality, of systems, and in this sense, for Tafuri, from the very beginning, the task of Marxist culture would be to place the architect in front of his own actions, to confront him with the awareness of the extent to which he is an instrument of transformation. He is the instrument of capitalism, and he is the instrument of this imposition on a reality. This is a path that begins in 1954-59, continues on, and will lead him to a definitive conclusions in architecture and utopia that we call Progetto Utopia. But this happened only more than 1 decade later. But let's make a little step back, just few years. The culture of commitment of the young Tafuri arises from, I would say, a form of rebellion, from a generational disgust toward the reality of the country. And I do not say this to outline again simply a biography, but rather to highlight the origins of his choice to become a historian. To become a historian for Tafuri was not the unique original passion. I would rather say that it was a consequence, an intellectual decision that took shape amid the ruins of a country that Tafuri perceived as hopeless. I will be more precise and will say that of his Rome, of his city, that he saw as totally hopeless. The university years, his professional experiences, his first activities as a critic and an activist, 1954-1964, all these years are characterized by Tafuri's analysis of the urban, administrative, and political dynamics of contemporary Rome. Tafuri is active in this association Italia Nostra, an association that is active in the protection of monuments and landscape, and writes several articles for the association journal regarding the scandals of Rome, of widening of medieval roads, of the destruction of palaces, the demolition of an entire neighborhoods like Borgo and the destruction of Bramante Palace, denouncing the continuity of the fascist policy of the 1930s in the mentality of the post-war mayors and the post-war planners. A major controversy involving Tafuri was the urbanization of Virla Doria Pamphili. He organizes conferences, discussions to raise the awareness toward the construction of a 4-lane road crossing and bisecting the park, destroying, obviously, archaeological remains. We're talking about Tafuri that he's not yet 25 years old. Besides the obvious destruction, Tafuri denounces the background of the project. The politics talks about necessary urbanization of Rome that is preparing itself for the Olympic Games in the 1960s, while Tafuri demonstrates the urban connection to unbuildable areas owned by the largest city real estate company, Società Generale Immobiliare, connected to the Vatican and an extremely problematic actor on the market who was fighting for the monopoly on the city house market. The second controversy, and these are only two of many of them, initiated by Tafuri, regards the park of Villa da Savoia, slowly eroded by building permits given by the city administration to the speculators that were building the dense neighborhoods, including famous Parioli. Here emerges for the first time, from the pages of Italia Nostra, also probably the chronologically first documented project by Manfredo Tafuri and his colleague for the preservation of this park. Actually, Tafuri's texts, I am just selected just few of them, are just episodes of a wider criticism that Italia Nostra, together with some other famous Italian journals like Il Mondo and L'Espresso, were addressing toward the policies of the two most corrupted mayors of the Roman history, of the Catholic Democrat Party, Democrazia Cristiana, Salvatore Rebecchini and Umberto Tupini. the symbol, let's say the tip of the iceberg of this corruption of the 1950s and 1960s was represented by the building permission that the city council gave for the construction of the Hilton Hotel on the panoramic, beautiful, untouched for millennia slopes of Monte Mario, a green public facing the historic city. The battle against this violence on Rome is led by Antonio Cederna, one of the founders of this association Italia Nostra, and one, I would say, maybe the first personal myth of Tafuri. In this project construction, many Italian architects, important architects were involved, like Pierluigi Nervi, about whom I will talk just a little bit later. So the architect Manfredo Tafuri, the activist Manfredo Tafuri, the citizen was raised up in the context of a general, I would say, indignation about what we usually call città democristiana, a demochristian city. In 1963, a masterpiece of Italian post-war cinema, Mani sulla città, so hands over the city, by Francesco Rosi, explained with a very lucid narrative through the case studies of Naples, how did this città democristiana function, seen by the young generation, young people, as in that time as really the so-called vergogna nazionale, so national dishonor. And if there is an Italian city that has taken on the characteristics of this Christian democratic city, that was Rome. A city characterized by a frenetic urban development in the years of the economic miracle of the 1950s. The city that has been ruled by a vicious cycle of public investment supporting the private interest, especially the Vatican. An important thing to underline before my conclusions is that Antonio Cederna, Italia Nostra, and Il Mondo, all L'Espresso, and Tafuri himself were not actually members of the Italian Communist Party. They were members of another so-called party, Partito Socialista di Unità Proletaria, PSIUP, a party that was external to the Communist Party, its ally, but critical of its dogmatism, that manifested itself in this acritical submissiveness toward the Soviet Union. If we put it somehow simply, it was a leftist party that criticized the ideology of the leading communist mother party. So to conclude, Tafuri, at a certain point, asks himself, well, in the context of this horrible national dishonor, in this vergogna nazionale, how do architects behave? So what do they think about all this story, and what do they think about this political and administrative situation? In 1962, he published an essential essay called La vicenda architettonica romana, and in my opinion, I would say the first great historical and critical masterpiece of the young historian Manfredo Tafuri. He examines the entire contemporary architectural scene in Italy, and I'm going now to read just a few sentences, give you the context of this judgment, and then I will conclude. In this very long essay, we face a series of condemnations, a series of judgments by Tafuri, which are very indicative of the future and the development of his historical and critical thought. We face, for instance, the condemnation of neorealism. Neorealism in architecture, the one that was proposing, reconstructing Italy in the positive sense. No? He was criticizing because he simply stated that it was totally different from neorealist cinema, which was documenting and describing, even with poetic action, a reality. While architecture cannot do that, because architecture has to build the future. And when you are a neorealist architect, you, I am quoting, run toward the city, but then you stop at the stage, at the scale of the village. It is, he will say, deprecable folklore. We forgot the modern movement. This is a nice recalling of Barham, also Barham criticism of the Italian retreat from modern architecture. And he said, this neorealismo exaltates a history that is not popular history of a rising class, but rather the history of a dominated, subordinate class unaware of its own state of subjection. Ultimately, a folklore extraneous to any healthy concept of realism. This is a clear a reference to Gramsci criticism on the realism of the 1930s and the problematic aspect of the relationship between intellectual and his invention of realist language, and clearly very close to Argan judgments on modernism that lost its original civil mission of the avant-garde times. In the same article, we face also the condemnation of the contemporary modernist architects that Tafuri called the poets of indifference. Miserable professionalism devoid of any content. And he was talking about the formal exercise of Monaco Luccichenti, or better known Luigi Moretti, that actually he condemned like an extremely conservative spirit. Architects that welcomed the legacy of the constructivist language, alienating it to the servitude of their professionalism, ultimately voiding it of all its ethical and ideological meanings. Why? Because all these palazzine were exactly financed by the Società Generali Immobiliari and all those building companies that were destroying Rome and speculatively dividing all its enlargement of the 1950s and the 1960s. We face then, we are in front of a dangerous state of confusion, the bourgeois rationalism. So also we face the condemnation of, I would say, His Majesty, Pierluigi Nervi, no? While in the rigor that this architecture of Pierluigi Nervi of the 1950s, we could find some ethical premises and ethical rigor, it is no longer, this allows for, let's say, making the same identification today. And it is not enough to fill the ideological void concealed beneath the perfect structural conception of those coverings, nor does it forgive the endorsement granted through a space that is emotionally engaging, but of course is on the service of the useless and criminal waste of billions in the, so concludes, and this clearly reclaims his readings of that time of Adorno, and especially the aging of the music on Vienna's generation, that this beauty of the structure, this quality of form, lost its rigor, since it is more guilty, putting an intrinsicable valuable talent at the service of forces and interests opposed to any form of genuine civil progress. So concludes the essay, however, let's say in a quite apocalyptic way, no? For the first time, maybe we face a disenchanted and really negative Tafuri. He writes, I will just quickly go to the conclusion, perhaps in no other major European city, the failure of modern architecture is more evident than in Rome. The history of the Roman post-war architectural environment is the history of hopes and illusions, as well of their collapse. It is a history of almost always failed attempts, the value of which often seem to consist in the teaching that emerges as negative testimony of failed operation. It is the history of a non-adaptation to an environment filled with hypocrisy and indifference, archaic inaction and moral inertia. So he concludes this essay by opening, however, a new consideration, which for us is very important. Somehow, let's say, a turning point, declaring the problem to be faced now is not to do, but to understand the reasons for this defeat. And Tafuri frequently uses these words: disappointment, intellectual crisis, defeat. Well, this is the defeat of the political and democratic ideals on which Italy has been built in the years following the war. The defeat of the ideals of modern movement, the defeat of the political action, the defeat in the battle for the preservation of Rome from speculators, the defeat in the debate on the plan of Rome, the general defeat of the architectural profession in the battle against reality. These are all experiences lived by Tafuri, and to use his famous expression, introjected by him already in the early years of his career, experiences that represented probably the reason, perhaps not the only one, but a reason for his decision to dedicate his career to history and critique, experiences that for sure definitely influenced his historical project, his vision of architecture and his vision of history. This is the last sentence, just to say that I repeat that somehow this was a generational trajectory, and Tafuri shared this journey with many other Italian figures, like Aldo Rossi, Calvo Moinino, partially also Vittorio Gregotti. But he reacts against this crisis, and I think this should be recognized in a completely different way than the others. Rather than closing the door to reality, like the phenomena of the autonomy of architecture, Tafuri starts to penetrate it, dissect it, to try to find the origins of this generational condition and to understand really the reasons for this defeat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luca, for your excellent talk. We heard you very well, so that was perfect.
Okay.